Her name was Anna. She was 12 years old. Today, her body would become a bargaining chip. Imagine the scene. A medieval city surrounded by enemies. Smoke rises above the walls, and the valley is filled with a sea of foreign flags. At the top of the tower stands a 12-year-old girl. This is Anne of Brittany, heiress to the last Celtic stronghold in France. She looks down and sees an army that has come not just to capture the city, but to take away her future. Her childhood ended abruptly. Yesterday, she was still singing Breton songs and learning to read her family's coat of arms. Today, her body and her fate have become hostages to big politics. For the French kings, Brittany was a tasty morsel. For the European monarchs, it was a bargaining chip. And for Anne, it was a home she had to defend, even though she was still a child herself. The siege lasted for days. Hunger, fear, tension. But the city looked at her and saw a symbol in this child. Because at the age of 12, she already embodied Brittany's struggle for freedom. Anne's story begins right here, in the tower, amid smoke and stones. She does not yet know that ahead of her lie a forced marriage, the loss of children, and decades of humiliation. But she already senses that her life will never belong to her alone. Next, a childhood steeped in Celtic traditions and the first cracks in a world that is about to disappear. To understand the tragedy of Anne of Brittany, one must imagine the world in which she grew up. At the end of the 15th century, Brittany was not just a province. It was an island of culture in the sea of France. Here, the Celtic language was spoken, different songs were sung. The coast remembered ancient legends, and the sea dictated the rhythm of life, and grew up surrounded by these symbols of freedom. When a child of the Montfort family was born, people celebrated as if it were their own daughter. For the fate of an entire people was concentrated in that small body. But Anne's childhood was short-lived. Her father, Duke Francis II, fought France for the independence of Brittany. When he died, the 12-year-old girl had no time left for games or dreams. His death became a symbolic boundary. The old world of Brittany was fading into the past, and the new one belonged to the stronger, those who knew how to take other people's lands not only with the sword, but also with dynastic treaties. Now, here's the question. How do you see this difference? A child who had listened to legends about Celtic heroes just yesterday had to become a heroine herself the next day, but in someone else's game, according to someone else's rules. And it was at this moment that neighboring monarchs set their sights on Brittany, and became the main prize in the great European bride trade. But the very next year, it became clear that this trade would not be just words. European dynasties were preparing to lay their cards on the table. 1490. Europe had not yet recovered from the death of Duke Francis II. When Brittany was left without a strong ruler, its neighbors sensed prey. 12-year-old and suddenly became the most desirable bride on the continent. Kings and emperors saw her not as a person, but as the key to strategic land. The most sensational step was her secret marriage to Maximilian Habsburg. The girl, who was not yet 15, became on paper the wife of the most powerful monarch in Europe. It looked like a saving alliance. The Habsburgs promised support, and Brittany had a chance to survive. But the alliance remained only on paper. While Maximilian hesitated, French troops advanced. Help from the Allies never came. For Anne, it was her first cruel lesson. In the world of politics, her body and her marriage were nothing more than a bargaining chip. She was ignored. She was sold. Now imagine yourself in her place. A 14-year-old girl suddenly realizes that the future of her country and her personal life are being decided somewhere in foreign halls, at foreign tables. And she herself is in this game not even a player but a stake. But the real test was yet to come. French troops marched on Rennes and Lorient. With the fall of these cities, Anne's last hopes of saving Brittany on her own were dashed. Autumn 1491. The French troops of Charles VIII approached Rennes, and the city was besieged. The pressure became unbearable. There was a shortage of bread in the narrow streets, the wells were running dry, and the faces of the townspeople were increasingly shadowed by despair. At the center of it all was Anne. She was only 14, but the weight of the entire duchy rested on her shoulders. When the city surrendered, it became clear that, and had no choice. The French king issued an ultimatum: marriage. Not an alliance, not a treaty, but marriage, where the girl's body became political proof of victory. Do you think marriage is an alliance? And it was a surrender signed with her body. Paris celebrated victory, while Rennes still smelled of ashes. And that was when France imposed its choice on, and the ceremony in Languillas was anything but joyful. It was the triumph of the conqueror and the humiliation of the vanquished. Chroniclers mention that after the first night, evidence was presented, a detail that modern historians question. But at the time, this was a way of showing that the union was sealed not only by papers but also by the body. Try to imagine what that meant for a 15-year-old child. When your innocence is put on display as a state act, you cease to be a person and become a symbol. For Anne, that night was a point of no return. She lost her privacy but retained her dignity in how she carried out her new role. Brittany found itself in a personal union with the French crown. The final legal annexation would take place after Anne's death in 1532, where instead of chains there were crowns, banquets, and protocols, but there was no more freedom. But her trials did not end there. The most painful part was yet to come: her own body, which became the arena of an endless struggle between hope and loss. Her marriage to Charles VIII did not bring in peace. She was expected to produce the most important thing, an heir who would finally cement the union between Brittany and France. And it was her body that became the battlefield on which this invisible war was fought. Pregnancy after pregnancy gave hope, but hope was followed by loss. Babies were born and died, sometimes before they even took their first breath. Each such death was a personal tragedy and a political blow to the court. When a child did not survive, and simultaneously lost her argument in the diplomatic game. Try to imagine how a young woman, not yet 20, felt about this. For her, pregnancy was not only a hope for motherhood, but also a test of her love for her land, because each heir could mean a chance to preserve at least a part of Breton independence. And every loss was further proof that Brittany was dissolving into France. In the eyes of the courtiers, she was not a wife or a mother, but rather an incubator for the dynasty. And this ruthless role gradually broke her from within. But history had a sharp turn in store. The one who ruined her life was struck down suddenly and absurdly by death, as if by a cruel twist of fate. 1498. France mourns the death of a young monarch, but the cause seemed like a cruel joke of history. Charles VIII went down in history not as a great commander or wise ruler, but rather as a symbol of absurdity. The man who ruined Anne's life died not on the battlefield or at the hands of conspirators, but from hitting his head on a stone lintel. Can one blow against a stone change the fate of a duchy? In 1498, that is exactly what happened. Think about it. The king who conquered all of Brittany died because of an accidental carelessness. But this death did not bring in freedom. On the contrary, at the age of 21, the widow found herself in an even more difficult situation. She remained the ruler of Brittany, but now predators were circling around her again. It was a moment of deep inner conflict. On the one hand, Charles's death could be a chance to regain at least some control. On the other hand, the French court had no intention of letting go of its prey, and understood perfectly well that a new marriage was inevitable. Indeed, the French court gave her no time to rest, and was once again made the main trophy in the game of marriage alliances. And ahead of her lay the public humiliation of Jean of France. The death of Charles VIII paved the way for his cousin, Louis of Orleans, the future Louis XII. But there was one obstacle. He was already married to Jean of France. The story of Anne of Brittany took a new tragic turn. This time she witnessed the humiliation of another woman. Louis wanted to make Anne his wife. To do this, he had to get a divorce. And the French court organized a real spectacle. Jean was publicly declared unable to perform her marital duties. In those days, various formulas were used to annul a marriage: lack of love, alleged infertility, or even too close a family relationship. But for Jean, it still meant public disgrace. Her personal life was turned into a subject of court and ridicule. Imagine what a humiliation it was for a woman of that time, and who had often felt that her body was being turned into political evidence. now saw another woman being thrown out of the royal palace because of her. It was a terrible dilemma. She understood that a second marriage to Louis was the only way to retain at least some of her rights to Brittany. But at the same time, this union engraved a new humiliation in her memory, this time not only for her, but also for another woman. The tragedy of Jean and the victory of Louis made and the wife of the new king of France, and was crowned Queen of France twice, a rare occurrence in history, first alongside Charles VIII and then alongside Louis XII. It would seem that her status was even higher, but in reality, she was sinking deeper and deeper into a mechanism where personal feelings, female dignity, and even motherhood were just details of a big political game. And yet, in this new status and managed to find room to fight, she turned her court into a center of diplomacy and culture, and it was here that her quiet but stubborn war to preserve the Breton identity began. Her second marriage made and Queen of France once again, but now she had learned to use her role differently. If in her youth she had been a hostage to the plans of others, over time she had become an experienced diplomat. Her court became unique. Alongside the lavish French customs, she insisted on preserving Breton traditions. The decoration, music, and even the attire of the courtiers reflected her native land. She founded the Order of the Cordeliers, a women's sisterhood whose symbol was a simple Franciscan cord, a sign of modesty and, at the same time, female solidarity at court. It was a quiet resistance. In the center of France, and created a little Brittany that reminded everyone that the duchy was still alive. She supported schools, artists, and writers. All this looked like cultural prosperity, but at the same time it was a political weapon. Culture became the battlefield where and could win without armies. Can culture become a fortress when the real walls have already fallen? Yes, she even used her own vulnerability as a tool. In a world where her freedom had been taken away, she built a new one, in knowledge, in traditions, in diplomacy. But time was not on her side. The trials of motherhood continued, her health was failing. And ahead of Anna lay her final battle, now not for herself, but for the future of her daughter Claude and the legacy of Brittany. And it was this final battle that would show how even in weakness, one can find strength capable of surviving the centuries. The year is 1514, and is only 36, but years of struggle and loss have made her older than her age. Numerous pregnancies and the loss of children have left their mark on her body and soul. But even as her health declined, her will remained strong. Anne's last goal was to preserve Brittany for her daughter Claude. She understood that if Claude became the wife of Francis of Angoulême, heir to the French throne, Brittany would finally merge with France. And yet this marriage guaranteed that the duchy would remain in the hands of her bloodline and not pass to strangers. It was a bitter and painful compromise, but it was Anne's last victory. She was unable to win freedom for her people with swords or treaties, but she ensured that the memory of Brittany would live on through her daughter, through her legacy, through the culture she so desperately supported. A compromise that saves memory. Is it betrayal or wisdom? Consider this scene. A woman, only 36 years old, looks at her child and sees not only her daughter, but an entire nation that has a chance to survive. It was not a resounding victory, but a quiet achievement, a small space of freedom in circumstances where freedom had been taken away for centuries. And when Anne's life came to an end, France solemnly bid farewell to its queen. But the true memory of her remained not in the lavish funeral, but in the hearts of the Bretons, who continued to whisper her name in the winds of their towers. 1532. Almost 2 decades had passed since Anne's death when Brittany was finally and legally annexed to France. But for her people, she remained a living memory. Anne of Brittany died at the age of 36, an age when most people are just beginning to live life to the fullest. Her body was taken to Saint Denis, where French monarchs were buried. It was a solemn funeral for the Queen of France. But for her people, she forever remained not a queen, but the daughter of Brittany. This is the paradox of her legacy. Formally, and lost. Brittany lost its independence and became part of France. But on a symbolic level, she won. Which is more important? Victory by the sword or victory by memory? And bet on the latter. She made an entire nation see in her the embodiment of their struggle. And even when the political borders disappeared, the memory of her preserved their identity. Just think about this fate. A girl who was forced to marry 3 times, who lost more than a dozen children and lived her life in the golden prison of the court, went down in history not as a victim, but as a woman who managed to turn her defeats into small victories. Victories of culture over oblivion, dignity over humiliation, memory over time. In Nantes, there is still a golden reliquary in the shape of a heart, where her heart rests. Symbolically, France took her body, but her heart remained in Brittany. And today, when states merge through agreements, the question remains the same. What preserves a nation, borders or memory? And of Brittany is not just a figure from the past. She reminds us that even in a world where everything is decided by foreign armies and foreign capitals, it is possible to preserve one's own voice. Her life was a series of losses, but it was through them that she learned to find strength where there should have been none left. And this strength has survived the centuries, in songs, in memory, in the wind that still whispers her name over Brittany.